Poor Jughead's hat. Ever since Riverdale, he's had a hard time finding work.
And now we present episode 4 of How to Be a 50s Drone.
So, you're a doctor, huh? Where do you specialize in?
Telling kids how to eat lunch.
How riveting.
Just before lunch one day, a puppet show was put on at school. It was called Mr. Bungle Goes to Lunch.
It was one of Jim Henson's throwaways.
It was fun to watch.
Trust us. They're happy on the inside.
In the puppet show, Mr. Bungle came to the boys' room on his way to lunch. He looked at his hands. His hands were dirty.
Like his porn.
And his hair was messy.
Like his love life.
But Mr. Bungle didn't stop to wash his hands or comb his hair. He went right to lunch.
And thus was the creation of botulism.
Then, instead of getting into line at the lunchroom, Mr. Bungle pushed everyone aside and went right to the front.
What? He was VIP.
Even though this made the children laugh, no one thought that was a fair thing to do.
We laugh at injustice.
Then, in the lunchroom,
That's paleo.
Mr. Bungle was so clumsy
That's vegan.
and impolite that he knocked over everything, and no one wanted to sit next to him. And when he finally knocked his own tray
said no
off the table,
onions!
that was the end of the puppet show.
As well as the puppeteer's career.
The children knew that even though Mr. Bungle was funny to watch, he wouldn't be much fun to eat with. Phil knew that a Mr. Bungle wouldn't have many friends.
But he didn't know how to
He
clap
wouldn't
like a
want to be
human.
like Mr. Bungle. Later, Miss Brown said it was time for the children who ate in the cafeteria to go to lunch.
The rest would
We
starve.
hoped there weren't any Mr. Bungles in this room.
There were, but hoping was the only thing that helped her sleep through those long, lonely nights.
Speaking of which,
Phil stopped to return a book to Miss Brown while his friends went on to the lunchroom.
Thank you for returning my 50
would have to
Shades of
catch up
Grey
with them
novel.
later.
end scene.
On his way to catch up with his friends, Phil almost walked past the boys' room.
Even
but
though
he
he
stopped
was
and
walking
thought,
right towards it.
Were his hands clean? No, they were a little dirty.
They were just
Phil
radiating
remembered
with
that
filth.
Mr. Bungle didn't wash his hands. Mr. Bungle's hair was messy, too.
Man, I should really
Phil
get a
didn't want to
haircut.
be
Starting
like
to look
Mr.
like a
Bungle.
hippie.
Inside the boys' room, Phil was surprised to see some of his friends washing their hands, too.
They normally just lick them
Phil
clean.
washed his hands well, with lots of soap.
I don't think lots means the whole canister, kid.
Then he rinsed the soap off.
But no matter how much soap he used, it could never clean his soul.
Phil dried his hands well, too. When he was finished, he threw the paper towel in the basket where it belonged. And then he made sure that his hair looked neat.
You know, all 5 of them.
Now, Phil and his friends were ready for lunch.
And thus concludes the secret bathroom meeting of the Aryan Youth Clone Party.
There was a line of children waiting to get into the lunchroom when Phil got there.
Ah!
Saw some
He
boys he knew at the
teleported!
front of the line.
Jesus.
They waved for him to go up to the front with them. But Phil didn't want to break into line as Mr. Bungle did.
Or he would get shanked again.
So Phil went to the end. That was the fair thing to do. He would see his other friends inside the lunchroom.
They were going to perform a Broadway tribute.
The
Ooh,
line
neat.
moved very fast, and soon Phil was inside. First he picked up his tray.
Maybe I could knock out the people in front of me to get ahead in line. They never said I couldn't.
Then he got his silverware.
Right out of the cleaning solution.
He put his knife, fork, and spoon neatly on the tray. And then he slid his tray along.
You know it's art when they film every single thing in real time.
He always enjoyed looking at the good food in the cafeteria. It tasted good, and was good for him, too.
Too bad he could only afford the gross food.
Instead of having a sandwich today, Phil decided to take the hot lunch.
Tofu ramen loaf, my favorite.
Phil took some bread and butter, too. And he knew what else he wanted.
Blood?
Milk.
Oh, whoops.
But Alice took the last carton on the tray.
That bitch.
Maybe there was more milk. So he said,
Hey, yo, bitch!
May I
Where's the
please have some
lactose?
Phil remembered to say, may I, and please. That was very polite. Yes, there was more milk.
They just got it from the rats in the basement.
Phil remembered to say, thank you, when he took the carton of milk. Phil had good manners. He didn't want to be like Mr. Bungle in the lunchroom.
Anywhere else was fine, though.
Phil didn't want to forget his dessert. The cake looked delicious.
So he took the whole thing.
At the end of the line, the lunchroom supervisor said she had noticed how polite Phil was, and she smiled at him. She wouldn't smile at a Mr. Bungle.
He wasn't white enough for her
Phil went to
liking.
the table where his friends were. He put his tray down carefully, pulled out his chair quietly, and sat down. He knew
that's
his
the
friends
IBS.
wouldn't like a noisy Mr. Bungle at their table. There was someone Phil liked, Freddie.
Kruger!
He always brought his lunch from home.
Like
It
a
looked
peasant.
good. Freddie had a sandwich, an apple, a cookie, and milk.
Well, they told him it was a cookie. What is that?
Before Phil began to eat, he always put a napkin on his lap. So did Freddie.
That was more to do with puberty,
Everyone liked Freddie. He was very polite. For example, if he had food in his mouth when someone talked to him, he always took time to chew the food with his mouth closed and swallow before he answered.
Gave him time to swallow his hatred.
Phil noticed how straight and tall Freddie usually sat. Freddie kept his feet on the floor, too.
Though that could have been the super glue.
Phil would rather be like Freddie
All right,
than
we
like
get
Mr.
it! Freddie's
Bungle.
a fucking saint!
Another
Jesus!
polite person everyone liked was Alice. For example, when Alice sneezed, she covered her mouth and nose. This protected her friends at the table from any germs.
Like the Black Plague.
While Phil and his friends ate, a boy ran past their table. You shouldn't run in the lunchroom. Only Mr. Bungle would do that.
Take him to the stocks. The execution begins at sundown.
Phil and his friends wouldn't like to have a Mr. Bungle at their table. Then lunchtime wouldn't be as much fun as it is.
They don't know what fun
Phil ate
is.
slowly and enjoyed his lunch. Finally, he had eaten everything except his dessert.
As his programming dictates.
He saved his cake for last. Only a Mr. Bungle would eat his dessert before he'd finished the rest of his lunch. And Phil wasn't a Mr. Bungle.
He was some sort of android.
The cake was good.
Too bad the other kids didn't get any.
Phil drank his milk carefully. Some children are messy when they drink milk, but not Phil.
Phil had mastered the art of sucking.
He sure
As
did.
each of Phil's friends finished, they didn't leave the table, but waited for all the others to finish eating too. Phil was the last one done.
What a loser.
He wiped his mouth and hands carefully with his napkin. Then he cleaned the table where he sat.
How much do you want to bet that
He
the
didn't want to leave
narrator
his
is a
place at the
manifestation
table
of
dirty.
Phil's increasingly obsessive mind
Everyone
falling
at the
further
table
into
cleaned
insanity?
his own place well. But look at that table. It was left very messy.
They were keeping the janitor employed.
Phil thought a Mr. Bungle must have sat there. But Phil didn't want to be like Mr. Bungle.
You don't
So
say.
he put his chair neatly into place. And his table looked fine. Not a piece of paper or scrap of food was left on it.
There's a lot of slobber, though.
No Mr. Bungle sat here.
He was watching them from the windows.
Phil's friends were careful to put their waste papers and empty milk cartons where they belonged. In this way, they helped keep the lunchroom clean. Phil was certain that Mr. Bungle wouldn't put his paper in the waste basket and his empty carton on the milk tray.
Or vote Republican.
Mr. Bungle probably wouldn't bother to put his lunch tray in the right place either, but Phil and his friends did.
One of us. One of us. One of us.
Lunch was good today.
Only 3 food points.
And then Miss Brown told Phil and his friends how proud she was of them. They had left their table the neatest in the lunchroom. No one here was a Mr. Bungle, and no one wanted to be.
They wanted to be an Oscar Mayer wiener.
Are you like Mr. Bungle? Mr. Bungle is a shame because he spoils lunchtime.
You should see him at breakfast.
Don't be like Mr. Bungle. Have good lunchtime manners, and lunch will be more fun for everyone.
These words would echo into Phil's head long into his 30s when he killed multiple people at McDonald's for chewing with their mouths open and not throwing out their trash.
Damn you, Mr. Bungle. Why did you have to be such an example of what not to be like? You could have saved so much bloodshed.